With the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 20th, 1914, it was obvious that war was going to be on its way. As Europe's diplomats searched to find solutions, Canadians here at home watched very carefully, and we actually prepared to do our part. Now, not all of Canada was behind the idea of going to war. In the month between the Archduke's death and the declarations of war, it became very clear that Canada was greatly divided on what part we should play. The Anglophone population was behind supporting Britain and its fight against the Germans, whereas the Francophone population were actually they actually saw things kind of differently. Many people in Quebec didn't feel that this war was Canada's war. They also felt no real sense of duty towards England, and there's no ties to France. Since the Plains of Abraham had occurred and the Treaty of Paris, and the French had kind of left Canada, the Quebecers kind of saw themselves on their own. Um, you know, Basically, what they were arguing there in Quebec is that since the Plains of Abraham had occurred, they're forced to look out for themselves, and England didn't seem to be giving much back to them. This is going to start to cause a lot of animosity because obviously the English speaking people in Canada are going to really claim that, Quebec is, they're traitors basically. You know, if they're not going to show up, it's because they are hiding behind excuses. So there are a lot of calls on Quebec to either join up or to stop being cowards, to get on the right side of this fight. So Canada is going to enter this war deeply divided, and it's going to be up to our Prime Minister, Robert Borden, to bring them together. So who was Robert Borden? Well, Robert Borden was born in 1854, and he was the son of immigrants from England. From, a really young age, he proved to be quite intelligent and very resourceful. He's going to grow up during that period of Confederation. And so he's really kind of our first prime minister who's going to get caught up in that nationalism that came with the birth of our country. So he, as he's growing up, he's going to excel at his studies. He goes on to study law, and he's going to join the Conservative Party of Canada, which kind of surprised his family because they were predominantly liberal. Um, he proved himself to be so reliable that pretty soon after, the Conservatives will make him the leader. And they're going to put him up against Wilfrid Laurier. And Laurier at that time, the Liberal Prime Minister, was extremely popular. He had been Prime Minister since 1896. And there were a lot of people who thought that he was going to remain in office until the day he died. So they needed to find somebody to take on this giant. And the Conservatives since 1896 had failed to get any traction with people who saw Laurier as this rock, as this steady force in Canada, as this guy who they called the Great Compromiser, because for every crisis he came up against, he found a way to compromise. So this is the guy they pick. They pick Borden. Okay, he's 58 years old, and in the election of 1911, he is going to run against Laurier and his Liberals. And the thing about Borden is he's able to bring Quebec nationalists, disillusioned Liberals from Western Canada, Conservatives here in Ontario, and Conservatives in the Maritimes together. And they're able to convince Canadians that Robert Borden is the right choice to take Canada deeper into the 20th century. And he is got to be credited by putting together this this coalition of different groups of people and bring them under the tent of the Conservative Party. So right from the start, Robert Borden is going to develop a vision of Canada, and it's all about development. So he saw that indeed Canada could and should support Britain in its move towards stopping German expansion in the early 1900s, 1910s basically, and stop them from dominating Europe. But at first, he's not so willing um, to support this without getting some concessions from Britain. Okay, the biggest thing that Britain's looking for is they're looking for money. They're trying to build up a navy to combat the growing German navy. And Canada didn't want to just kind of hand over money to go to this military force. He wants Canada to definitely have some say. He wants Canada to have some control over its own destiny and where the money's being spent. And he gets Britain to agree to this. So, as we go into the beginnings of the summer of 1914, and tensions are really, really high in Europe, Borden is going to go on holidays. And unfortunately for Borden, that's the time when the Archduke and his lovely wife, Sophie, and they always say his lovely wife, Sophie, for some reason in every history book I've ever read, are killed by a young man by the name of Gavrilo Princip. So he promptly returns to Ottawa, and he's going to bring Canada into the war. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to appoint a man by the name of Sam Hughes as the commander of Canada's forces. And without a doubt, Canadians, they rallied to sign up. Many of them were signing up because they felt a kinship to the British Empire, and they were signing up to fight for their king and their country. But that didn't matter because, the numbers were still coming in. There were also a very active group who wanted to sign up because they loved Canada. So together, our forces greatly jumped in our numbers. And, Sam Hughes has the job of turning, average everyday Canadians into this military force that is going to be able to fight in this war. So they bring all these guys to a place called Valcartier, Quebec, and they get ready to fight there. And, we got to give Sam Hughes a lot of credit. Now, Hughes is a really strange guy. He's pretty eccentric. And, the one thing we got to kind of say about Hughes is he's going to put together all of the resources required to get these troops trained. They get shipped off to England within 6 weeks of their training starting, some of them. And they end up getting stationed in a place called Salisbury Plains. They're ready for action. And the British love the speed that the Canadians are arriving, and they see that they're a capable force. Well, let me rephrase that. Not everybody did. The British commander at the time was a guy by the name of Lord Kitchener. You probably would know Lord Kitchener from those posters because he's basically doing that pointing thing. He is going to see the Canadians as colonials. And, he is really going to take the approach that these Canadians should be used as he saw fit, and they're going to just be fed into British units. They're kind of replacements, or even in some cases, although he didn't directly say it, they're cannon fodder, which means they're going to be the first ones going in because, Kitchener didn't see their lives as being as important as, those of the regular British soldiers. So, what we kind of see here is Hughes recognizes what's going to happen, and he goes to Borden, and they're able to fight with Kitchener and basically say, look, you're not going to get to break the Canadians up and put them in different units. The Canadians have to stay together, because this is what we saw happening with Irish and Scottish and Welsh units. They're all kind of being put to where they were needed. So Hughes does something really great. And, this is going to lead to not only the creation of a number of Canadian divisions, this is the beginnings and the foundation of what would be the Canadian military. And we have a very strong, united, proud tradition here in Canada, and it all gets started right here thanks to Hughes and Borden, convincing Kitchener not to just throw us into the wind and put us wherever we're needed to plug any holes. Now, as I mentioned, Kitchener sees us as being colonials. And there wasn't a lot of high expectations from Kitchener or others in the British High Command of how we're going to do. Um, but what they don't realize is that Canadian spirit. That Canadian spirit was in place even then. We have no difficulty recruiting volunteers. Canadians enthusiastically go inside, sign up. Now, it doesn't hurt as well that Canada was kind of going through some economic hard times. So people joined so that they could get paid. So just to kind of show you how high the recruitment numbers were, on October the 3rd, 1914, the first wave of recruits, that was 31,000 Canadians, actually set sail to go to the battlefields of Europe. And this is going to be the largest convoy to date to ever cross the Atlantic. Now, Hughes had done whatever he could to get it together, and in reality, we're poorly equipped. Um, we don't have the best supplies. We're going to get really crappy rifles called the Ross rifle, and these things were, without a doubt, not built for the war that was going to come. They jam up easily, they often misfire, and they were just a bad gun, but they were cheap. So, the Canadians are sent over there. We're not going to see any combat really until the spring of 1915. Obviously, we're going over in October. Wars don't really get waged uh, during the winter. It's not really the ideal time to be starting a war, let alone fighting a war. Now, they are going to fight, obviously, through World War I during these winter conditions, but it's going to take time. There's always a spring offensive. And, when that offensive starts in the spring of 1915, the Canadians were deemed ready for the front lines. And we go there, we are razor keen, ready to go. We are ready to fight. The reason why is they kind of believed nothing would be worse than the Salisbury Plains where they had been staying. They thought those conditions were bad. They have no idea what's to come. In the years ahead, they're going to find out, tragically, that this, Salisbury was a paradise compared to the trenches that they were going to be forced to live in. So the first Canadian troops to arrive in France were known as the Princess Patricia's Light Infantry. They called them the Princess Pats. And, they are basically going to land in France in December of 1914. And they're going to be paired up with the British 27th Division. And they're going to see action at St. Eloi at the Polygon Woods. This is really kind of the first major group of Canadians to see fighting. The rest of the division's on its way. And they get there in early 1915. That's when the first Canadian division reaches France. And they're thrown right into the trenches. Now, they do get a little bit of training, okay? And then they are given 4 miles of trench line to look after in Archimedes. Now, right away, they're faced with the realities of dirt, disease, rats, lice, and overall, death. Not to mention the fact that these trenches were always filled with water. So you can imagine the conditions were horrendous. And very quickly, a lot of those young men who joined up for glory, they were going to go and fight for their country. They were going to have adventures. They were going to come home and be able to, tell these stories, to their family members and, to young women they met. All of that goes away very quickly. And it happens because of the first battle that they're involved in. And this is known as the Second Battle of Ypres. So this battle is important for a couple of different reasons, not just for the fact that the 1st Canadian Division is going to be the ones to fight there. It's also going to kind of really change warfare for the worst. So in the first week of April 1915, the Canadians moved into what was supposed to be a really quiet sector of the front lines. It's really close to the city of Ypres. You know, to the Canadians on their right, it's my right, it's probably your left, so maybe that side, were two British divisions, and on their left there was a French division. So they're between two of Europe's biggest powers. Um, the attack begins at Ypres on April the 22nd. And, up until that point in the war, we really had kind of had a stalemate. Nobody was seeming to get ahead. We couldn't really declare anybody as a clear winner. They're just too evenly matched. So the Germans decide that they're going to use a new weapon that they had been developing, poison gas. Um, I got to point out, the Germans weren't the only ones developing this. The Allied forces were as well, but the Germans are going to be the first to use it. So what they're going to do on the Allied lines is they're going to hit them with a massive bombardment of artillery shells. Uh, they want to kill as many guys as possible. They want to beat these guys into submission. And when they're done that, they're going to release approximately 160 tons of chlorine gas into, the light northeastern wind. And you're going to see these thick clouds of yellow-green chlorine drift over the trenches. And very quickly, the French defenses are going to crumble. And the troops are caught off guard. They are unprotected. And they start to feel the effects of the gas right away. Their lungs are going to be basically burnt from the inside. Uh, the chlorine gas, it will set any exposed skin that's got, water on it on fire. So, you'd be sitting there and your skin would start to bubble. You breathe that in and, it's going to burn your lungs and it's going to cause you to die. Not instantly, and you got to bring in a lot of it, but it's still going to happen. So, what we're going to see is, the troops are going to flee. Those who aren't falling down, they're going to run away when they start to feel the effects of the gas. Um, and the one thing that's going to happen is, both the French and the English troops leave. The only thing that's kind of going to be fortunate for the Allies here is the Germans had only planned a limited offensive. They didn't bring the reserves. And they're going to have a 6-kilometer gap, but they're not going to be able to exploit this. So, they start to move forward to try to get through this gap in the front lines. And, they are going to only really make it, 2.5 kilometers in before they have to stop and dig in themselves. One of the problems that hits them is the wind changes direction. And they get caught in some of their own gas. So you've always got to take into account that wind, because you don't want it coming back at you. So the other thing that they have to face as the Germans were coming through is they had to deal with the Canadians. See, the Canadian troops didn't run away. Let me say that again. We didn't run away. We stayed and we would defend our position. One of the things that definitely helped us was the fact that one of the Canadian soldiers who was a student at the University of Toronto recognized instantly what they were dealing with. And so he told his comrades, the other soldiers, to quickly take out their handkerchief and to urinate on it and to put it over their face. The reason why, the ammonia inside the urine acted as a counteragent to the chlorine. So it allowed them to not face the issues that the French and the English were facing. So the Canadians stood their ground. The Germans didn't expect that. As well, the Canadians are going to mount this counterattack in a place called Kitchener's Wood. The Germans are starting to approach closer to the town of Ypres. They want to get them out of this wood, and these woods are full of all these mighty oak trees. It's, as I said, it's close to Ypres and a place called Saint Julien. So, in the morning there are 2 attacks they're both kind of disastrous. It doesn't work out very well. The Canadians are going to suffer a lot of high casualties, but it's going to buy some precious time to close out the flank on the Allied lines. So those brave Canadians gave their lives um, so that we could stop the Germans from progressing further. And things aren't going to get better there from there. There's going to be a very grim battle at St. Julien on April the 24th when the Germans attacked. And their goal here is to just obliterate everybody. They want to end this war quick. They think that right now the Allies are on the ropes. And, they're going to, again, bombard. They're going to just hit them with everything they've got. And then they're going to hit them with another gas attack. This time, though, they're not going after the British and the French. They're going after the Canadians. And, the fighting is going to be terrible here. The Canadians are going to be, dealing with shrapnel from the artillery shells, chunks of metal flying everywhere. And some of those shells exploded, raining chunks of metal down on them. There's heavy machine gun fire going on. As I said, their rifles, the Ross rifle would jam. Once you got some mud and some water in there, that's it. It's done for you. And the last thing you want to do is go into a war without a gun. On top of that, many of the men were getting violently ill. The Germans are not just using chlorine gas here. They're also using things like tear gas. And so, the Canadians are putting handkerchiefs over their faces, but it's not going to be enough. But we don't run away. To coin a phrase, elbows up. The Canadians, we stay in our spot. We hold our ground, even though in the 2 days of us staying there, we're going to lose 6,035 men. That's one out of every 3 Canadians who are fighting there. We stay there. Now, this is a really huge act of heroics by the Canadians and their leadership. And little do they know, and a lot of the Canadians thought this was going to be the worst it was going to get. The worst is still to come. So following this battle, the decimated units of the 1st Canadian Division, reinforced by volunteers as well as a cavalry brigade, they are going to march south to join the Allied offensives that were already underway. So they're going to kind of get there to try to help out. The big place they're going is Artois, and the British there are mounting what are called diversionary attacks. They're trying to draw the Germans in away from other areas so they could shore up their line and attack in different places. Now, Artois started because the French launched this very, very unsuccessful attack, and they're going to fail. And so the British are basically going to come in, and they're going to go at a place called Aubers Ridge, and they're going to be pushed back by the Germans. It's another horrendous battle, but they're not going to stop. The offensive is going to continue, and that's where we come in as Canadians. We're going to be thrust into this fighting at a place called Festubert in May of 1915, and Gravenchi in June. What we're seeing here is this grim pattern of frontal assaults against the enemy's defenses. The British were following this tactic called going over the top, where you sent the Canadian forces and your own forces, the British forces, running across no man's land directly at the German trenches. And as you can imagine, the result of this is going to be massive casualties and a large number of dead. It's going to cost the Canadians at Festubert 2,468 casualties. Like that's a huge number. At Gravenchi, there's another 400. The numbers of dead are they're mounting, and things are getting worse for the Allies and for the Germans. One thing that's becoming very clear is the plan here is this is going to be a war of attrition. They're going to fight to the last man standing. And it really goes to show you how little regard the upper classes of both Germany and Britain, look at those lower classes. Um, this is that real class divide there that we're seeing, and they see their men as kind of being expendable. And that's again one of these tragedies that occur in this war, because this is a modern war, and it's a war where we see for the first time what we can call weapons of mass destruction. Weapons that are designed to kill a large number of people in a short period of time. Most notably, of course, is like the machine gun. Um, you can't just run at a trench anymore because the enemy's just going to mow you down. And that's what's going to happen at what is going to be perhaps the greatest tragedy of the First World War. That's the Battle of the Somme. Now, both sides are going to limp into 1916. They see that this war is not going to end quickly. And I should point out, when World War I initially broke out, they're saying 4 to 6 weeks at most. It's going to end by Christmas. They're wrong. I mean, there's this very cavalier attitude when the war breaks out. Like, just to kind of put it into perspective, uh, King Edward of England, a few days before the war begins, is meeting with his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, and their other cousin was the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II. They're all share one grandmother, Queen Victoria, who we learned about before. They're together. Like, the Kaiser visits England, and before they leave, they actually cut a bet. They have a bet as to whose side's going to win. So they're betting on this like it's going to be, a football match, soccer for those of you who don't know. Um, like, it shows you just how much they don't understand what they're going to be getting, but they're going to figure it out thanks to the Somme. Um, it's really apparent to both sides that, you know, trench warfare might be too effective a tactic. Both sides are taking heavy losses, and this war had become a defensive one. And a defensive war always results in a lot of death. Later on, when you look at World War II, you're going to see that that's an offensive war. That's a war that's always on the move. Yeah, there were points where people dug in, but it's about moving forward. It's not about staying put. So, the Canadians are going to go into 1916 facing their own share of really hard battles. So after Festubert and Gravinci, they're going to next fight in the Battle of St. Eloi. And this is where the Canadian 2nd Division, these are the new guys coming over, are going to face their baptism of fire. This is the first real taste of war they get. And they get there, and there are tons of craters filled with water. There's shell holes everywhere. Um, you know, you could just imagine these guys probably saw themselves walking into a swampy hell. Now, a couple of things that were a little bit different here. The Canadians, they're showing up wearing their new steel helmets. So, they have a little bit of extra protection on their heads. Um, those helmets are not going to be enough. They're going to suffer 1,373 casualties in 13 days of what can only be described as confused attacks, counterattacks. You know, there's waterlogged craters, there's minefields. Um, it's just not great. And this is where we're going to see perhaps the greatest number of losses up to that point. And it's going to occur when, the newly appointed commander of the Canadian Corps, a guy by the name of Lieutenant General Julian Byng, he is determined to win back Mount Sorel and Hill 62. These are two very important strategic locations that the Germans had taken earlier. Byng wants that back. So he gave orders for a very carefully planned attack. And this attack is going to see the Canadians going in, and they're going to be supported by artillery. Okay. And the guy who is going to kind of be the center of this is going to be Major General Arthur Currie, and he's going to bring in the 1st Canadian Division. And, you know, what's going to happen is they're going um, to basically themselves be bombarded by the Germans before, the Canadian infantry attack on June the 13th. And what makes this battle so interesting is they're going to attack at 1:30 a.m. So it's dark. There's wind hitting them. There's rain going on. It's the kind of day you don't want to attack on. I mean, in reality, what day would you want to go and attack? But it's the kind of day that you want to avoid this kind of attack. And the careful planning paid off. Currie is going to prove to be extremely good at planning, these kinds of battles, but the cost is going to be extremely high. At Mount Sorel, the Canadians are going to suffer 8,430 casualties. That's nothing compared to about what's going to hit them at the Somme. Both sides could really see that the only way to snap this chain of trenches was to break them. So, in the western region of the Somme, and the Somme's kind of an area, they chose to attack with a joint French and British assault around mid-year. And this attack is going to start on July the 1st in broad daylight, where we're going to see 100,000 men climb out of their trenches, advance shoulder to shoulder in line, both behind each other across this crater-worn wasteland called No Man's Land. They're also going to be weighed down. They're going to be wearing 66 pounds of equipment each, and they're going to advance slowly towards the waiting German machine guns. And the result is going to be a slaughter. 57,500 British soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing on that first day. That's the heaviest day's loss ever suffered by a British army. Here the Canadians are also going to suffer a great deal as well. They're going to suffer at the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel.